Hey everyone. In this video, I'm reading my thoughts on the 17th century poetry and prose for this week. The readings for this week provide a fascinating look at the intersection of politics, love, religion, and sexuality in the 17th century. As might be expected, the men take a different view of these topics than the women, a view that is dominated by a desire for conquest, for domination. Take Donne's The Flea for starters. As is typical of the erotic poetry mostly men were writing at the time, the analogy of the fleas feeding to the sexual act brings together images of violence and inevitability. The conceit, as such extended and complex metaphors are typically called in literature, is itself an assertion of imaginative authority over the object of the speaker's affection. The metaphor becomes a bedchamber for the sexual act, figured here as the commingling of the individual's blood harvested within the flea. Quote, "Oh, stay 3 lives and 1 flea spare, where we almost, nay, more than married are, this flea and you and I and this our marriage bed and marriage temple is." End quote. Citation lines 10 through 14. The rhetorical purpose of the conceit is to naturalize the sexual act and, in the process, strip the act of its moral and ceremonial weight, trivializing the maiden's conflation of virginity and honor by claiming that just as much honor will be lost in her intercourse, quote, "as this flea's death took life from thee," end quote, citation line 27. At the same time, this naturalization trivializes the violence inherent in Donne's proposal. The image of the woman having, quote, "purpled her nail in blood of innocence," end quote, foreshadows Donne's intention to take her virginity, implying this act is no worse than her killing the flea. Citation lines 20 through 27. But the imagery of blood and murder cannot be avoided, as much as Donne tries to make the woman equally complicit, nor can the potential consequences of the sexual act. Quote, "And yet this enjoys before it woo, and pampered swells in one blood made two," end quote, citation lines 8 through 9. The metaphor has different implications for the two genders. The swelling figures both Donne's erection and the maiden's potential pregnancy. As much as Donne wants to present the loss of virginity as of minor consequence to the object of his affection, his conceit betrays him. And so it goes for Donne and the other male poets, whose attempts to woo their love interests cannot avoid the imagery of conquest. When in Elegy 19 to his mistress going to bed, Donne calls the body of his undressing lover, quote, "Oh, my America, my newfound land," end quote. The imperialist undertones cannot be ignored. Donne is claiming the female body as his to colonize and exploit. In The Vine, Robert Herrick's conceit is even more explicit, using his, quote, "vine," to strangle and bind his love interest, quote, "My curls around her neck did crawl, and arms and hands they did enthrall, so she could not freely stir," end quote, citation lines 14 to 16. And Herrick's sophomoric punchline leaves no doubt as to which, quote, "mortal part," end quote, of his body the vine represents. Citation lines 23 to 24 and 1. As poetry, this is an outrageous admission, but Herrick knows that there are rhetorically more effective ways of getting laid. Herrick's "To the Virgins to Make Much of Time" makes use of a common argument. We are only young once. time and beauty are fleeting. And while his proposal to, quote, go marry sounds wholesome enough, it is underscored by a different sort of threat. Quote, for having lost but once your prime, you may forever tarry, end quote, citation lines 14 to 16. Here, the threat is more psychological than physical, with the implication that a young woman's avoiding sex and marriage can only lead to a different sort of confinement, permanent isolation. In To His Coy Mistress, Andrew Marvell's approach is slightly more romantic. His argument is based on the premise that he would prefer their love to grow, quote, vaster than empires and more slow, end quote, citation line 12. Even if it means her refusing him until Judgment Day, citation line 10. However, Marvell notes, life is much too short to wait. Even here, the imperialistic and apocalyptic overtones of the imagery eventually give way to an even more provocative threat than Herrick's, that if his love interest waits too long, quote, worms shall try that long preserved virginity, end quote, citation lines 27 to 28. For Marvell, the proposed act of love is again a violent one, as he suggests they, quote, tear our pleasures with rough strife through the iron gates of life, end quote, citation lines 43 to 44. Unsurprisingly, Mary Roth's speaker seems traumatized by love and courtship in Pamphylia to Amphilanthus. Having first been unwittingly implanted by Zeus and Cupid with one of their, quote, burning hearts, citation section 1, line 8, Pamphylia's perspective on love is not of a conqueror, but of a captive. Quote, am I thus conquered? Have I lost the powers that to withstand which joys to ruin me? Must I be still while it my strength devours? And captive leads me prisoner, bound, unfree, end quote, citation line, section 16, lines 1 to 4. She is speaking here about love, but she might as well be responding to the advances of quarters like Donne, Herrick, and Marvell. Quote, why should we not love's purblind charms resist? Must we be servile, doing what he list? End quote, citation section 16, lines 9 and 10. But love is also depicted throughout much of the poem as a child growing inside the speaker. She has been impregnated with a desire she cannot control, that can only be coddled. This figure of love can therefore be understood as representing the immaturity of her lover, the volatility of her own emotions, and the motherhood that is likely to result from her romantic longing. But if the male courters seek to conquer their beloved to avoid being conquered themselves by desire, Roth's method is to negotiate between the competing forces of love and desire. Quote, in this strange labyrinth, how shall I turn? Ways are on all sides, while the way I miss, if to the right hand, therein love I burn. Let me go forward, therein danger is. If to the left, suspicion hinders bliss. Citation, section 77, lines 1 through 5. The way out of the labyrinth, the way to escape captivity from both her desire and the desire of men to control her, is ultimately to, quote, take the thread of love, end quote, citation, section 77, line 14. To trust her feelings will guide her towards personal freedom, as opposed to viewing desire as a danger to be tamed by conquering desire's object. The masculine vision of dominance and subjugation also influences Donne's religious poetry and Hobbes's political vision. For Hobbes, the natural state of man is savage. His famous line is that life in the state is, quote, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, end quote. This becomes an argument for political subjugation to a monarchical authority. Citation, line 747. For Hobbes, only by giving up one's power to a monarch can one ultimately live in a civilized state. Donne takes a similar approach towards religion. His invitation in the Holy Sonnets to, quote, batter my heart, three-personed God, end quote, citation, section 14, line 1, flips the roles of his erotic poetry. Now he is the one submitting his body and soul for God to, quote, ravish, section 14, line 14. But just as in Hobbes's vision of submitting to a monarch provides a legal basis for asserting power over others, Donne's submission to God gives him the standing to overcome the ultimate conqueror, death, again turning the traditional power arrangement upside down. Now it is death who is, quote, slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, end quote, citation, section 10, line 9. Not the other way around. But just as Roth reimagined love and desire by imagining herself a labyrinth to escape, Margaret Cavendish's solution to her own political repression is to create new worlds for herself to rule and inhabit. In doing so, she postulates that only by reimagining the world can men and women release themselves from the cycle of dominance and submission. To be sure, the first world she imagines still has a monarch and confines women to their closets to worship so they do not distract the men. Religious and political leaders are castrated to prevent their being unduly influenced by wives. Citation, page 785. But there is an element of satire here. This is also the first world, and one that achieves stability by embracing diversity over competition. It's, quote, men of several different sorts, shapes, figures, dispositions, and humors, end quote, not to mention species, coexist without many laws based on the theory that, quote, many laws make many divisions, end quote, citation, page 784. When, in a meta-narrative twist, the Empress invokes the soul of Mary Cavendish herself, the Empress tries giving her a world of her own to rule by calling upon the immaterial spirits. But because the physical worlds are all ruled presumably by men, the immaterial spirits suggest an alternative. Quote, for every human creature can create an immaterial world within the compass of head or skull. He may create a world of what fashion or government he will. End quote, citation, page 787. The fact that only an imaginary world can give Cavendish the power and independence she craves may seem defeatist, but it also offers the possibility of hope. After all, the imaginary world she creates is the one that we are reading now, centuries later. Through writing, rationality, and imagination, Cavendish can conceive an alternative to the Hobbesian mindset that infuses the male writer's views of romance, religion, and politics. In her own words, quote, I'll take your advice, reject and despise all the worlds around me, and create a world of my own. End quote, citation, page 787. All right, that's it. Thank you for listening.